A few years ago, about a year after my dad got a big promotion from work, my family moved to the suburbs in a much nicer area of town than we had been living in before. We were all extremely happy with the move, and our quality of life went way up. I was 15 back then and eager to make some money for myself. I was getting my driver's license soon, and if I was going to enjoy my freedom to the fullest, I was of course going to need money. So I set about sweet-talking all of the neighboring families, mentioning all of the babysitting I had done in my old neighborhood. I had never done any babysitting before, but I figured they didn't have to know that. Before long, my Friday and Saturday nights were booked solid with babysitting jobs that brought in ridiculous amounts of money for very little work. I typically only had to take care of 1 or 2 kids for a couple of hours before I put them to bed, and I quickly became comfortable with my duties. Most of the jobs were boring, but the Miller kids were always a chore to take care of. The Millers lived in the house directly beside us, and they had identical twin boys that were both nightmares to keep watch of. Their names were Jack and Michael. Jack was a quiet boy, and he was always my favorite of the pair. Michael, on the other hand, was hyperactive and constantly loud. He liked to boss Jack around, and on more than one occasion, I would leave to get a snack ready for the boys or use the bathroom only to come back to Michael trying to beat Jack senseless on the floor. I wouldn't really have thought anything of it. Boys will be boys. But there was just something about the way that Jack interacted with Michael that was off-putting to me. He would cower from him sometimes and shut his eyes. When he did this, Michael would lean down and whisper in his ear. I could never make out what Michael was saying, and the one time I tried to lean in to listen, Michael snapped his head up and stared at me, clearly angry that I was trying to listen. He's just a 5-year-old boy, but something about it gave me the creeps. Jack will talk to him though, and sometimes they seem to get along well. At the end of the night, Jack would beg me not to tell his parents about anything bad that Michael did. A few times I told him that I'd had enough and that I was telling them anyway, but the look of fear in his eyes after I said it always kept me from it. At the end of the night, his parents would go up to the room that the boys shared, check on them, then come back down to pay me. Then I would leave. I did this probably 12 times for the Millers. A year ago, after a particularly bad night of Michael behaving horribly and tormenting Jack, I decided it was finally time to tell his parents about it. I put the boys to bed and decided not to mention my plans to Jack. When the boys' parents came home, I told them right away. The look on their faces when I mentioned Michael's behavior made me instantly regret mentioning anything. They paid me without saying a word, and Mr. Miller asked me to leave. He said that they appreciated all the times that I babysat for them, but not to expect any more calls from them. I walked out of the house, stunned. I had no idea what would make them act like that. The next weekend, I was at another neighbor's house, the Howards, to babysit, and I asked them if there was any reason that trying to talk to the Millers about Michael would bother them. I sat horrified as Mrs. Howard told me the story of how, 3 years ago, Michael had gotten hit and killed by a car after running into the road right in front of their house. I don't know how to explain what I saw so many times at the Millers, but needless to say, I quit my babysitting jobs after that.
When my sister asked if I could babysit my little nephew Jack for the night as she and her husband had a wedding to go to out of town, I said no problem. I love the little guy. Now 3 years old, he's at that really fun age where he's starting to speak well and is developing his own personality. He's also pretty well behaved, and I was promised $50, so it seemed like a no-brainer at the time. I had only been to my sister's new house during the day at this point, never at night. I remember how excited she was when she first got the keys. None of us could believe she'd managed to bag such a big, beautiful old house for so little money, and I was quite excited to pretend it was mine, even if it was only for one night. I had grand visions of ordering a pizza, watching old films on her huge 50-inch widescreen TV, and stretching out on the giant leather sofa. But then things got weird. Jack's bedtime was at 7 p.m., so at 6:30 p.m. I got him his milk, tucked him into bed, and read him a couple of books. That kid is really into Beatrix Potter for some reason. It wasn't long before his little eyelids got heavier and heavier, and soon he was fast asleep. To celebrate, I popped the kettle on and settled down to watch something stupid on Netflix. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is being awoken with a jolt by the sound of Jack crying and screaming at around 11 p.m. Jack has been prone to night terrors and usually calms down after a bit of soothing, so I went upstairs to reassure him. I was surprised to see him sitting bolt upright in his bed, his little face pale and densely stained with tears. "It's all right, Jack. You were just having a nightmare. "Come on, lie back down," I said softly, laying him back on the bed. "I'm not Tom. I'm not Tom." He whimpered. "I didn't say you were silly." I smiled. He often said the funniest things. "The lady did. She kept calling me Tom." "I'm not Tom," he insisted angrily. "A lady in your dream? It's not real, sweetheart," I said. "It was just a dream." "No, she was here. She was here. I'm not Tom," he whispered. His whole body was shaking. It took a while, but I stroked his soft, curly hair until he fell asleep again. I went back downstairs and decided to have a quick cup of tea before going to bed myself. I was just putting the kettle on when I heard a loud bang on the front door. I glanced at the clock. 12 a.m. Who the hell could that be? As I approached the door, I could see the blurred silhouette of what appeared to be a woman through the frosted glass. It was hard to be certain as it was so dark outside, but she appeared to have long hair and to be wearing white. I walked slowly toward the door. I could feel my heart pounding inside my pajama top. I carefully unlatched the door and paused for a moment before throwing it open. I was shocked to see nothing. There was no one there. I was so confused. Was the silhouette a trick of the light? The shadow of a tree? I stepped out of the door and onto the patch of grass in front of the house. I looked all around but couldn't see anyone. Just darkness. Suddenly, I caught a flash of white in my periphery. I slowly looked up to the window of Jack's bedroom, and that's when I saw her, the lady. Although the night was black, I could see her very clearly. Her face was deathly white and framed by long, dark hair. What terrified me most was her expression. She wore a painfully wide, manic grin that stretched across her entire face, showing sharp, angular bones. She didn't move. She just stood there, grinning, her eyes crazed and unblinking, focused on me. I have no idea how I summoned the strength to break free from the all-consuming fear that had frozen me in that spot, but I found myself running back into the house. I raced up the stairs to Jack's room to find him lying on the floor, screaming and sobbing hard. I picked him up, grabbed my car keys, and ran out of that house as fast as I could. I can't remember if I even locked the front door. All I wanted to do was get Jack as far away from that place and that lady as possible. Jack slept at my flat that night while I stood watch. As he lay beside me, breathing softly and peacefully, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Who was that lady? Should I have called the police? The next morning, my sister called at around 9 a.m. "Where are you? Where's Jack? Is he okay?" She cried on the phone, panicked and confused. "We're at my flat. We're both fine. Something weird happened at your house last night. We had to leave. I'll explain when I see you." I said it as calmly as possible. "We're here now. The police were outside the house when we arrived. Apparently our next-door neighbor's child has been abducted. I thought for a second it was Jack and..." She started to cry again. "It's not Jack, don't worry, he's safe. Your poor neighbors, though, do they know what happened?" My mind was racing. "No, but the police are searching the area. Hopefully they'll find him soon." She sighed, exhausted. I suddenly felt an ache deep in the pit of my stomach. "What's the boy's name?" I asked, already knowing the answer to the question. "Tom," she replied. "His name is Tom."
When I graduated high school, I went to college for only a year. I didn't finish because of personal reasons. I needed to make some money, and finding a job in my little town wasn't easy. My mom suggested to me that Mr. Frederick was in need of a sitter, basically a nanny, because he worked out of town and was away for sometimes weeks. The kids would stay with their grandmother on occasion, but she was getting up there in age, and it was difficult to manage 2 young children. That next weekend, I called and asked if he was still looking for a nanny, and quickly he replied, yes. We discussed what I would be paid and so forth. I was to start the following weekend and would have to watch them every other week. Matthew was 13, Julie was 8. Their mother died while giving birth to Julie. But with that being said, they were still very good kids and very well behaved. I arrived on time. Mr. Frederick was putting his luggage in his trunk when I pulled up. He greeted me with a smile. He gave me a list of numbers if I needed him, and told me he thought Julie was coming down with a cold and not to let her outside for a few days, just to be safe. He went in to kiss the kids goodbye and was on his way. The first night, the kids went to bed after playing a few board games with me and watching a movie. Julie seemed better until she woke up at about midnight, throwing up violently. I rubbed her back and put a cold washcloth on her neck. I was about to call her dad, afraid she might have something more than a cold like the flu. But she said she felt much better afterwards and just wanted to go to bed. I was sleeping in the guest room when I was woken up by laughter. I opened my eyes and Julie is sitting on the foot of my bed, Indian style, back facing me. She was still laughing when I sat up. I laughed a little with her, then asked, "What are you laughing at, sweetie?" Almost immediately after I asked her, she stopped laughing and almost sounded like she was growling. I said her name softly, kind of confused about what she was doing. She starts screaming, "Stop laughing at me," over and over. I get out of bed immediately, grab onto her shoulders and start yelling her name. "Julie, Julie!" She then looks at me, grinding her teeth, and says through her teeth, "I slit Matthew's throat," she said, and then her laughter started again. I ran to Matthew's room, busted through the door, and found him sleeping peacefully. I was afraid to go back downstairs. I told myself, "Don't be afraid of a little girl I've seen grow up." I make my way down the steps when Julie is standing at the bottom. "I'm tired. Can I go to bed now?" she asked me, rubbing her eyes. I just looked at her and simply said, "Yeah." Maybe she was dreaming because of the Tylenol I gave her. It made her sleepwalk. I brushed it off. The next morning, both kids were sleepy, so we ate breakfast. I took them to the park. We had a busy day. At bedtime, I couldn't help but feel fear. That shit she said to me through her teeth about her brother just wasn't right. I sent them to bed. I noticed when Julie was running up the steps, she smiled at me, and I smiled back. Then she turned around the second time and smiled at me again, and it freaked me the fuck out. It wasn't her smile, her cheerful little sweet girl smile. It was like she changed within seconds. I know it was just a smile, but it made my heart drop. 1 a.m. I'm texting my friend Liz, just talking about the day and bullshitting. When I heard what almost sounded like chanting, I put my phone down and made my way towards the sound. At the top of the flight of steps, Julie is standing there, feet basically off the first step. Seriously, her heels were the only thing on the step. I kind of yelled at her, "Julie, get off the step like that, you're going to fall." She kept saying something, it sounded like nonsense, and then she started saying it slower while she was looking at me. I'm not the most religious person, but I know the Lord's Prayer, and she was saying this backwards. It freaked me out. I just stood there, mouth open, eyes not blinking, throat dry, listening to this 8-year-old say this prayer backwards. "Julie!" I yelled. She stopped, looked at me, smiled, and said goodnight. I heard her door close, and I locked my door and walked out. The next day, Matthew gets up early, looking awful. "Are you getting sick?" I asked, putting my hand on his head. He grabbed my hand and looked me in the eyes and said, "Julie scares me. It sent chills through my body." I asked why. He immediately answered, "She watches me sleep, but I'm not sleeping. She laughs and says things I don't understand." I asked him what kinds of things, and he said he couldn't understand her. It sounded like she was just, and he did this thing with his tongue. To me, it sounded like he was trying to say she was speaking in tongues. Julie walked into the kitchen. Our conversation was over, and Matthew got up from the table with his cereal bowl. She grabbed his arm and while looking at me said, "Don't trust the whore." I screamed at her, "Hey, don't you talk like that again." She smiled at me and in her cheerful little voice asked, "Can I have some Lucky Charms?" I called my mom, who said she was simply acting out because her dad was away and she wanted attention. I told her I was getting freaked out, and she just went on to give me this lecture on how Mr. Frederick was counting on me. The last night I was there, same routine movies and bedtime, I got a hug from Matthew, and Julie followed. I felt bad for not wanting to hug her. She squeezed me hard and kissed my cheek. Then she whispered in my ear really slowly, "I wouldn't sleep tonight." This voice was much deeper and more manly than a little girl's. I cried. It completely terrified me. I'm worried a fucking demon child is going to kill me in my sleep. I didn't sleep at all. I stared blankly at the TV infomercials. That's when I heard screaming. Horrible. Makes your heart drop screaming. I flew out of the room and ran up the steps. I checked Matthew first. He was closest. He was just staring at me when I opened the door. He then ran with me to Julie's room. I opened her door when she was right there, right in front of me, but her head was bent so far back that it was touching her back. You could hear clicking from her bones. I feel bad now for doing this, but I slammed the door and called 911, followed by calling her dad, being hysterical, and telling him about everything that had happened. Julie was taken to a mental hospital, evaluated, and let go. They said she suffered a slight brain aneurysm and a seizure. I never babysat for the Fredericks after that. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and leave a like. You can submit your stories to our email in the description. Stay safe. See you guys in the next one.